I'm not done yet. Folks, if you can still hear me. All right, go to part 2. Refresh and go to part 2. And once you're there, all right, Keliophyllesium says that's working. Rosenshad said, all right, I'll give a little time here for everybody just to get back into that different part. Sorry about that, folks. It just went dead. All of a sudden, I got an error message. It's not storms or anything. It just died. The feed died. So we'll go with this. And I'll give everybody a little time to get refreshed. All right, we were talking with Dana and intention, and I was talking about the absurdity of some of the things that you're asked to do in those grimoires. And I was pointing out that if there's intention in the circle, there's intention behind the grimoires themselves when they tell you to do things. And that intention, particularly with some of the either more absurd and irrational things, or quite frankly, just downright disgusting things that you're asked to do, when you allow yourself to practice those things in ceremonial magic, you are subjecting yourself to that intention. So this is why I always caution people to be very, very careful. In fact, I would tell people, don't do that stuff. Just avoid it altogether, because you're subjecting yourself to things that are literally embedded tension. Remember, those grimoires, I said earlier that you can make a psychometric object and embed intention into anything. Those grimoires especially are psychometric objects. They are already, by dint of what they are. Eudemonist, boy. If you subject yourself to those practices by using those grimoires, you're subjecting yourself to the intention embedded in them. This is why I say best not to practice any of that stuff at all. If you really understand this stuff, then you, number one, don't need them, and number two, you'll have intentions that are not commands upon the universe or commands upon other life forms, be they demons or angels or whatever, but requests. And that's the difference. That's the difference. All right. This one is from Eve, and she's actually submitted 2 questions. And June makes a very important point regarding this. She says the emotion is trained by the absurd instruction to lose spiritual discrimination. Yes. Empty your mind. Well, why? Why empty your mind? Well, so other things can fill it. Okay? Very easy. Very easy. Yes, Dana, Talismanic Publishing, same thing. Same thing. Same thing. This is why I'm very, very skeptical of any techniques of meditation that begin by telling you, empty your mind. Well, what they're really telling you is, and they'll come right forward and say it, let go of your ego. In other words, let go of yourself. In some cases, that's necessary, but that's a spiritual discernment where you let go of your narcissistic compulsions to want to dominate or be in control. But you're not making a let go of who you are, and that's a very different thing. And to my very Western and admittedly Christian impulses, that's a very dangerous thing. You're opening yourself to things that are just not good. All right. This one is from our friend in China, Eve. She has two sets of questions. The second one is a very interesting one because it goes back to what Danis just said. And in fact, I'm going to read that second one first. She says, I'm not sure how to write this question or express the thoughts I have in my mind, but I'll try my best to do that. As we know, long ago, before trade became so easy and fast, we did not have the food allergy issue. And you also mentioned it in one of the members' Vidchats, drink the local honey, which could reduce the allergy symptoms. And to me, that was like a hit on my head. For a long time, I followed only the rules from the Chinese tradition. Drink the local water to reduce the allergy symptoms. Drink honey was also a fantastic idea. Why didn't I think of that? Unfortunately, we have no local produce honey here in Singapore. Otherwise, I would love to test it out on my daughter, as she has very bad nostril allergies. She often has cold-like symptoms. Anyway, how is that related to my question? Well, if today we seem like we have more and more allergy problems, could that be due to imported food sources? Yes, absolutely. It means our DNA is forced to adjust to other than local food. Note that the majority of Cantonese or Hong Kong people can't drink milk, especially fresh milk, because they will have diarrhea because they do not have cows locally. It was introduced. So in that sense, if our beloved astronauts had their DNA changed due to long stays in space, wouldn't it be possible that they will face a challenge for food allergy problems? I'm going to doff my hat here, Eve, because you're on to something, and I want everybody to hold that thought. All right. After all, most of the food is produced here on Earth, which means it sings an earthly song. As an earthly human, our DNA sings a similar song. So earthly produced food wouldn't annoy us. If the astronauts' DNA can no longer sing a similar tune, wouldn't it be an issue? And in the same sense, when GMOs kicked in, what if this agenda is multiple? Could one test what it would do to a human being, B, researching a solution to reduce the food allergies for their stormtroopers in space? It is not like they could produce food in space, the moon, or Mars as easy as Earth. Well, Eve, you're on to something, let me tell you. It is true, in my experience, and I can't speak for anybody else, when I'm eating local produce, I have much less, if I can find local produce where I live, I have much fewer allergy problems than I do if I eat produce produced, say, from Mexico or from Iowa or wherever. I have different reactions, allergic reactions to that food. So food is, like it or not, a part of your, if I can use Dr. Sheldrake's term, is part of your local morphogenetic field. Now, with allergies in mind, let's go to outer space and say we have human colonies on the moon and Mars. Now, it is a fact that they have tried to bring back soil samples. They did bring back soil samples from the moon, if I recall, and they tried to grow potatoes or tomatoes or something. I don't remember when. This was back in the late 70s during the Apollo program. And sure enough, yeah, they could grow food in the stuff. But I don't think that there are any tests of histamine reactions of people to that food. In other words, of allergic reactions. My suspicion is, Katie B just said that she thinks that you would be less allergic in space and Mars because that's where we're from. Well, yeah, but we've been here a long time. My suspicion, Katie, is the exact opposite. Let's say we go to Mars and we start growing food, asparagus or whatever on Mars. Are we going to see an increase or an uptick in histamine reactions? My bet is, yeah, we probably will, by the nature of the case, until we get accustomed to that environment. That's a fascinating question, Eve, and I think you're onto something. All right. The second set of questions, she says, I know that you listen to Dark Journalist's X series, so I don't have to repeat what he said. So here are my questions. How do we know that the White Brotherhood, truthfully, as they said they are, and are doing what they are doing, is trying to save humanity and guide it to a better place? Well, answer is we don't know that anyone is doing what they're saying they're doing. A certain wise man once said, you shall know the tree by its fruits. In other words, you can tell me, this is my favorite line with Republicans and Democrats. You can tell me that you're trying to do the good of the country, but is the fruit of what you're doing actually doing that? And the answer in most cases, as far as I'm concerned, is no. Okay. So in other words, test what their claims are, Eve. If they are not doing things that are good, then probably that their claims are false. Number 2, how do we know that this Ahriman figure wasn't created by the same group of people who are also controlling different mystic schools by creating fear to control the masses? I'm sorry if my point of view is wrong, but I really do think that way. And again, yes, being a patristics person, I can look at the history of religion, and at times I'm wondering, why was this done if it wasn't simply for some purpose of controlling a population? That to me seems egregiously the case in I can point to all sorts of cases in Christian history where something was done not from any theological purpose, but simply for the purpose of social engineering and exercising a bit of control. And I think you have to look at the same possibility with every religion, that yeah, they can manipulate those symbols to their own purposes rather than to the purposes, for a theological intent or for the purposes of the religion itself. Absolutely. Number 3, if those ascended masters, saints, and gurus are so powerful and know so much, why didn't they share the secret of monatomic gold throughout human history directly? Not sharing that secret and the telluric current node points or ley lines actually can affect the human body. The secret list goes on and on. Again, Eve, I'm not disagreeing with your main point. I think in some cases, yeah, things can be shared, but also you've got to remember that there is another track in those mystery schools, and you run into this over and over again. And pardon me, at one point in my life, I would have agreed that, keeping everything secret is bad, until I came across some very, very dangerous implications of the metaphor, which I have to this day refused to talk about. Well, you run into those types of things in those traditions where they will say some things are just too dangerous to talk about outside the circle of the initiate. And I think in some cases that this is true, that there are certain things that you just don't want, so to speak, your bad neighbor to get a hold of. In other words, I think it's a very bad idea if certain people I've known in my life knew how to make hydrogen bombs. I wouldn't want these people making hydrogen bombs. So yeah, you cover up a certain amount of knowledge simply out of the fear of it falling into the wrong hands. So I hesitate to say that every time you run into that, you're dealing with bad intention. I think in some cases it's very good intention. Number five, or pardon me, number four, what is this White Brotherhood's group and its definition of a worthy person and to receive their secret teaching or sharing? Um, in most cases, Eve, that I'm familiar with, and I'm not familiar with this Ariman thing that Daniel's been getting into. I can't watch all of those broadcasts, so I'm not familiar with what he said. But in most cases, I would imagine that it is something to the effect of having compassion for life, for human life in all of its forms, in all of its stages. We certainly don't see that today with, the campaign to abort babies and ship elderly people off to the nursing home where some death panel is going to tell you, well, this person's beyond help. They need to be sent on their merry way. There's this war against the non-middle stages, if I can put it that way, of humanity. The same thing with animals. I think, and psychologists will tell you this, that if you abuse animals, chances are you have suffered abuse and you'll go on to abuse humans. I think one of the key tests for these schools is compassion. And the other test that you constantly run into, Eve, is humility. And humility is a very, very tricky spiritual state because in my understanding of the practice of virtues, humility is not running around saying, oh, I'm a terrible person, I'm awful, blah, blah, blah. That's not humility. True humility is seeing things to the degree that you are able with the eyes of God. Or if you're not a theist, true humility is seeing things exactly as they are, as they really are. C.S. Lewis makes the point that someone who is truly humble, say an architect, will be able to design the world's most glorious cathedral and say that it's the world's most glorious cathedral and not have any ego invested or any pride invested in that statement because it's the truth. So I think that those are the two markers that usually pop out when you're looking at that kind of literature. I can't speak for the Chinese tradition, but I would imagine that it's very similar. All right. Number 5. Again, if these ascended masters and teachers are so powerful, how come they never review the truth about why no one has fixed the broken mechanics of the solar system? Wouldn't it be much easier if the broken mechanics are fixed and the human race could have their perfect state of physical bodies back? Especially those groups constantly channeling different masters or the 9. If the 9 really are the 9 principles of what they said they are, they didn't know our solar mechanics are broken. Good point. The only thing I would say in challenging that, Eve, is that in order to fix the broken mechanics of the solar system, you would literally have to be capable of, either reconstituting the asteroid belt or placing another mass out there in orbit around the sun that would restore whatever mechanics were. And that would require a technological sophistication that we do not yet, as far as I'm aware, have. So I think there's a technological limitation here. Number 6, if there is another agenda to create different groups in order to generate confusion and chaos, and also create this syntactic enemy, namely the Ariman, the D-wave, or whatever, to generate fear, and the White Brotherhood could act as a hero to save mankind, why haven't they done it? Any thoughts? Again, I'm not convinced that the Great White Brotherhood is the Great White Brotherhood. And number 2, more importantly, Eve, I think what you're really asking is, why haven't they drained the the mystery school swamp, so to speak? And there, let me draw an analogy to what some people think is the case with President Trump and the people fighting him. He was elected on a promise to drain the swamp. And everybody's now asking, well, why hasn't he drained the swamp? Well, my response would be, and again, I'm not trying to defend him, I'm just trying to draw an analogy. My response would be, number one, he probably got in there and found out that the swamp is a lot more, if I can put it this way, defecatory and deep than he imagined it to be. And he probably imagined it to be fairly deep because, after all, he's been in business with some of these people for a long time. So in other words, part of the problem is you can't go in and fix that kind of institutionalized, systemically embedded corruption overnight. And in America's case, that corruption has been embedded at least since the Kennedy assassination, if not before, in the administration of Woodrow Wilson. So it's been embedded and grown like a cancer for a very long time. And if we're dealing now with the case of a global group that has been embedded, you cannot simply do that overnight. They may be fighting it, and I would aver that there is something fighting it, because if that evil and corruption were in total control, this world would be a lot worse looking than it is. So I think part of it is just the understanding, number one, that they're not all powerful, and number two, the swamp is pretty deep. Number 7, what is the real agenda of these mystery schools? And that is a question that I have pondered a long time. For most of these mystery schools, I think really the agenda is power and to gain control over people and to manipulate events. For some people, the Great White Brotherhood, so to speak, I think it's simply to ward off evil and to keep it from triumphing completely. But I have to make a caveat here, Eve, and everybody else. I think increasingly that the Great White Brotherhood, so to speak, is not an identifiable group or secret society or what have you. It's us. It's us. We're that other secret society that all of these other groups are against. We're that secret society. And I know that sounds kooky and kind of new agey and so on and so forth, but I increasingly am coming to that idea as a serious idea. All right, now this one is from Katie with a Y. She did not put her username on this. And Katu, it's Katu. I'm sorry, Katu. Wait, right at the end. And Katu, I'm sorry, if you're in the chat room, let me look here. Welcome to P-Bud, who came into the chat room. I don't see Katu, but let me refresh this window because I want to make sure that she hears this. She sent me 5 pages of questions. So in order, folks, remember, try and keep it to 1 or at best 2. I'm going to try and save these, Katu, or resubmit the ones for the next vid chat that I don't answer. All I'm going to do today is the first page, and then I'll try and remember to save these for the next vid chat. If I don't, if you haven't, resubmit the others as 1 page. All right. So here I go. She says in the Vidchat of May 11th, you spent several minutes answering Down Under's questions about Thomas Aquinas and the Aurora Consurgens. I have a few follow-ups to Down Under's questions and your answers, and then some further questions and speculations about the nature of our created reality and its population. In his first question, Down Under asked, is it possible that Aquinas did indeed read something which proved the God of the Bible did not create man? Unquote. You answered the first part of the question by referring to various sources for the idea that mankind was created as an androgynous or hermaphroditic creature. You referenced the Babylonian and Palestinian Talmuds, which are not covered in O'Brien's work and which date from later than the Nippur tablets. I think you missed Down Under's point. He claimed in the last Vidchat questions and in the previous Vidchat questions about dinosaurs that the O'Brien's work proves the biblical gods did not create man. So, A, do the Sumerian texts referred to in the O'Brien's work prove that the God of the Bible did not create man? I don't think you answered that question, and I've listened to this several times. It might be deliberate. Not commenting on whether or not the O'Brien's work proves that the Bible is false means the assertion is not examined. I think it should be. It's my contention that the O'Brien's work proves nothing of the sort. And I would agree with you. No, I didn't. I think maybe you're trying to parse my words a bit too carefully. I would never assume that their work disproves a divine creation for several reasons. It is questionable from the standpoint of Yahweh, because there you're dealing, I think, increasingly with a character that's at odds with the character of Yahweh described in later books of the Bible, specifically the prophets, where, you know, this murderous behavior is toned down quite a bit. And then by the time you get to the New Testament, you're dealing with a very different characterization of God. So in that sense, you know, the term God of the Bible is ambiguous to me from that standpoint. And so I wasn't trying to dodge the question. I was simply trying to flesh out what he was getting at. I don't think that the O'Briens disprove that, although they may have in their own minds set out to do so. But they do, to their credit, I think, raise some moral questions about the character of Yahweh that, if you're honest, have to be asked and addressed. I think that was their intention. Does the O'Brien's book, The Genesis of the Few, claim that mankind was created androgynously? No. The reason I went there is because I was trying to put their speculation that there's evidence in the text of genetic engineering of chimerical life forms into a much broader perspective. That perspective indicates that there was an original androgynous creation, and then at some point subsequent to that, you had an intervention. And I believe what I said was that was the first of many interventions in the history of the creation of man. And that's really what I was getting at. B, could Aquinas have inferred an androgynous creation from the ancient Sumerian texts? From what I have studied, Daly, Kramer, Neeland, Barton, your own Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, I would say no. I cannot see any indication in the ancient Sumerian texts written about by the O'Briens and others that mankind was created as androgynous. And I don't believe I made that claim. If I did, I was mistaken, but I don't believe I said that. I was, again, simply referencing the androgyny as a part of prior creation, that there is a subsequent intervention. So in other words, you have one intervention, then you have another intervention where mankind is being deliberately tinkered with. That's what I was getting at. Number 3, the Aurora Consurgens might have been inspired by something Aquinas read, but was it inspired by ancient Sumerian material? No. I referenced the Talmuds very deliberately and in connection with the Greek Old Testament version of the Bible. I was not referencing those in relationship to the O'Briens and the material they were reading. He was asking me, could he have read something that would have led him to that conclusion? And Aquinas, being a medieval scholar, would have been familiar, at least, if you go back and listen to what I said, at least with the Periphyseion of John Scotus Eriugena, which is a work based on St. Maximus the Confessor, which Aquinas would also have known and probably have read, since he references the Periphyseion in his various theological writings, and even on occasion references St. Maximus. And he may have been, if he was the scholar I think him to have been, he may have been familiar with the two Talmuds as well, and that whole tradition of the androgyny. So that's what I was trying to address there, Katie. Katu. I was trying to address where Aquinas, as per his question, where Aquinas was picking these things up, and that's what he asked. He was not asking me, did Aquinas get this from the Sumerian text? He was asking me, could he have read something? And my speculation in answer to the question was yes, and that was my guess as to what he might have read that would have set him down this trail where you end up with the androgyny that you see going on in the Aurora Consurgens. And that I'm going to save the rest of your questions, Katie, but if you want to resubmit the others, tone them down to basically one page so that I can get through them all. But I'm going to save these other questions and remind me in future vid chats so that I can cover all of these, because you've got quite a lot of questions here. All right. This one is from Byzantra. All right, here we go. She says, unfortunately, I won't be able to be in chat due to working the night shift, but I've been rereading a book published in 1969 when I was about 13 to 14 years old. It's a Dutch book called Extraterrestrial Civilization by Stefan Danerde. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. In short, it proposes communism with a nihilistic philosophy backed a society, because that creates the super civilization that is desired to connect with the other cosmic civilizations out there. The book uses cognitive dissonance to the hilt, and the so-called high technical know-how described in the book could be mimicked today, I would dare to say, even at 1969. What for me stood out was the outright attack on Christianity and Caucasian or white people and creativity. The author is Roman Catholic, and the discussion of Christianity is based solely on Roman Christianity and not a hint of Christianity before the schism or the mention of all the various forms of Christianity since. Apparently, it is only the white race that is discriminant and arrogant. The other races on earth seem devoid of that foul act. Their creativity seems about creating, via selective breeding, a perfect creative mind devoid of selfish desires within a body that can only, according to them, crave selfish desires. If creativity is solely a mind thing that should be decoupled from a foul body, I suppose that way any craft can be bypassed. Wouldn't want to overload those superior cosmic minds, now would we? The cosmic aliens promote openly through the book communism, Buddhism, and a mixing of races that wipes out race difference entirely, and to my mind, the eradication of all creativity of any sort that needs freedom and a fully functioning body-mind connection to flourish. Needless to say, I don't agree with their assessment of what Earth's population needs. Their society might be neat and clean, but it is also devoid of life. It seems highly mechanical. The peoples and their material world. If anything, it sounds like an Ahriman society described by dark journalists X series. In this tale, however, there is the absence of eugenics and transhumanism in direct visual fashion. I suppose the creation of a biological, totally controlled robot does not need culling in numbers, and the implants can be internal and therefore not externally employed and thus visual. Their planet is far more densely populated than ours. Clearly, the book had a nefarious agenda from the outset, and from that viewpoint, I'm not amazed that the writer is a known multinational industrialist. The seemingly short-timed planning by politicians is clearly steered by the long-term planning of our covert overlords, whoever they may be. The attack on Christianity and our innate use of creativity, promoted to be quelled, if not outright destroyed, do not surprise me either. The white race problem, however, still eludes me for the most part, but it is clearly in full swing today. The online version is not the same as the book, and for me, the so-called later new tacked-on philosophy is very telling compared to the untranslated important chapter in the book that are conveniently left out of the online version. So my question, is the white race a problem due to being a very mongrelized race, or due to containing in that mongrelized race a very pure Caucasian race that has properties that are to be feared? The book states that the mixing of all races would lead to a light brown race. Then why is the most mongrelized one on Earth white? The white race has not the numbers of Asians or even the Indian community, so why all the fear? Are there properties buried in white DNA that can emerge through wild or non-selective procreation? So why the call for culling it into extinction? Do you think that there is a balance between consciousness and material density culminating in a tipping point where creativity can't emanate enough so that biological humanoids get more and more mechanical in denser environments and therefore more devoid of creative drive? I ask this question because the planet and its inhabitants seem more physically dense than on planet Earth and therefore more drone-like. What Largans describes as creative seems highly simulated, mimicked from a world that has creativity. If anything, they seem highly jealous and or afraid of creativity and want to therefore eradicate it on ours. If my supposition in the above question has any merit, could that be the reason behind cannibalism and the other related savagery? To acquire others' characteristics, you eat it. And that indeed, Byzantra, is the rationalization in some of those cannibalistic societies. Literally or through osmosis, thickened right up to the right density through fear and flavored by addictive intakes, creating an effective addictive merry-go-round, thus promoting self-hate through a despicable sin, would be right up some very jealous mind parasite's alley. For the aliens acquiring some form of creative energy, and for the practicing natives on Earth losing that same creativity through despicable sinning, two birds with one stone, so to speak. The book describes a ritual performance like our Mass on Sunday. Besides the aliens, there is a centrally placed axle and spokes system that begins to rotate and becomes a bright turbulent sphere. In the meantime, 7 veiled women are dancing with shocking movements to the beat of the music until the sphere emanates a fixed orbit for every known color. The music and dancers stop, and the crowd experiences a shock that increases their concentration on the color spheres, which start moving again. The whole affair made me think of a mini version of the spheres from the movie Contact, accompanied by a Maurice Béjart ballet on screeching Igor Stravinsky notes. Could it be a simultaneous contact through mutual ritual between their world and ours? Our gorging in blood, and they're far more serene on the receiving end of those blood energies. Contact induced by the multitudes of alien minds with confined consciousness, but energies received by the elites. So many things in this book ooze the hidden hand of fallen angels hiding behind it, that yet another, but by them seemingly successful, tailor-made alien culture, and using that to the hilt. Direct contact seems not possible anymore, but indirect contact seems to be booming. I'm going to doff my hat on that observation, Byzantra. By becoming fallen, they are at a disadvantage, but seem to retain godly knowledge to misuse at their leisure, making us work for every inch of freedom or trapping us in the hall of mirrors of simulacra. Do you think the fallen angels had something to do with the Tower of Babel? Yes, I do. Yes, I do. They fit the bill for politic motivation and selling that as a moral conundrum to us. The coupling of matter and consciousness does not invite the meddling from other consciousnesses to meddle in our affairs to shape matter, which they can't do directly. Wasn't the Tower of Moment predictable? Unquote. Now, Byzantra, you've got so much going on in that comment. And I don't even know really what your question is or if there is one. But I have to comment. And I'm gonna base my comments on the series Star Trek. As many of you know, I'm a science fiction fan. I like science fiction. My favorite science fiction series of all time being Babylon 5. And for the surprising reason that Babylon 5, unlike a lot of science fiction, did not indulge in socialist utopias. It did not indulge in envisioning some future super advanced non-theistic scientific utopia. In fact, in Babylon 5, you're confronted with atheism, agnosticism, and a variety of religions, human and alien, that is just downright bewildering. But it's the presence of those human things that make the series believable. I always compare Babylon 5 to Star Trek because Star Trek to me is a mess, not as simply as a series where you don't really have any storyline. You've got memes and plots and episodes, but you don't have a storyline. And some of the memes in Star Trek disturb me precisely because you have a quasi-communist ideology. You have dressed up a progress to the point where we don't need money anymore. And you have all of these bows to New Age Gnostic psychology, but no one has any sort of understanding that's rooted in any sort of identifiable spiritual tradition. It's a mess. It's a mess. And one of the things I think you're getting at here that also disturbs me about a lot of this science fiction is precisely its very, very subtle attempt not to attack the white race. I think that's a misreading, but an attempt to create the idea that there is some sort of virtue in the attempt to subsume all human cultures into this bland tapioca pudding hodgepodge. And yet, and you see that clearly in Star Trek, and yet at the same time, there is this wonderful prime directive that says that they can't interfere in the development of another culture. Okay. The contradictions and so on are just astonishing. To me, Star Trek is a mess because it's a product of a messy mind. Babylon 5 is not that way. It does not dodge the central philosophical questions, although different races or different species out there are going to answer those questions in different ways, but it does not dodge them. And I think that's to its credit. Now, Now, about the white race being mongrelized, to me, it's, when I came out with Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, I was literally slammed by a certain segment of society that, for want of a better expression, let's just call white supremacists. I was billed as a traitor to the race. I got angry emails. I was a secret Mossad agent. I was a secret Jew, and I am a traitor to my race. It went on, and folks, you would not have believed the stuff that I was receiving. But it is true that from a genetic standpoint, Caucasians are really a messed up lot. We really are. We have much higher incidence of Rh negative blood problems, and I have yet to read a good explanation of where that really comes from and why. We are unique in other health problems that other races don't experience to the degree that we do. One of them being the fact that in Caucasians, there's a much higher incidence of females that have Y chromosomes, the male sex chromosome, that, creates endless horrific health problems for these women. And you don't see nearly the same high incidence of this that you see with Orientals or with blacks or what have you, and the question is why? Why is this race so, from a genetic standpoint, so very mixed up? And I don't know. There are ancient stories that it was white people that came down and taught all these other civilization, which are there. But my problem with those is you put those stories into the hands of Theosophy or the Nazis, and you end up with these genocidal racial ideologies that themselves make no sense. No one knows the answer to these mysteries. I certainly don't. There is some sort of cultural attack going on by the globalists that, like one earlier commentary put it, that just wants to reduce everything to this cultural hodgepodge. And I don't care what culture it is. They don't want any culturally distinguishing things to be extolled. And, for now, their target is Western culture, but I can assure you they will do the same thing to Chinese culture and to Hindu culture and to African culture. Name a culture and they're going to target it. They don't like distinction, and they don't like diversity. And to me, that's the key to Western culture. You have, within one little continent, namely Europe, you've got all these different little national cultures that are producing, wonder stuff simply by their interactions with other cultures in that little continent. So it produced a lot of good. Anyway, I hope I'm making sense out of your comments. They are spot on as far as I'm concerned with why I don't like a lot of science fiction. There's always these dystopias of one sort or another that they seem to push. All right. This one is from Katie, that's with the IE, and she is in the chat room. And she says, what is the significance of coming of age rituals? And not just that rituals at different points of a person's life, such as Jesus being 33 when he died on the cross. Let me stop right there. That's primarily a Western tradition. You don't find that tradition in Orthodoxy if you really look carefully and long and hard enough. In fact, there's a certain theological tradition that would indicate that he may have died at a much older age, like in the 50s or 60s. So that's not a universal tradition. It's a tradition and nothing more. It's not an actual teaching. Do certain actions and rituals, listen carefully, folks, do certain actions and rituals activate epigenetic change? I'm doffing my hat here, Katie, That's one of the most profound questions we've had. Changes that are best induced when the brain is fully matured. Also, what about people who have the same or similar genetic mutations? Could these be amplified in some way when there are a group of similarly genetic people? For example, I am convinced that my brother-in-law shares similar genetic mutations as I, and when I'm around him, synchronicities happen at an alarming rate to the point where he notices and points it out in amusement. I also note that looking at ancient Sumerian depictions of what looks like DNA strands and what could be construed even as eye motifs, I note that they are always associated with fish. Why do you think this might be in the context of your recent article on Oannes? I also note that octopuses are characteristically demethylated and many die at the pre-larvae stage, almost like something went really wrong with their genes at one stage in their genetic history. Their development is highly susceptible to climate and nutrition. Do you think the current assault on our environment and food could be related? I cannot help but make the visual association between octopus heads and elongated skulls. All right, leaving octopus aside here, Katie, let's go to this idea. To me, the most fascinating question that I've heard in a long time, even for these vid chats, is this idea: do certain actions and rituals activate epigenetic changes? Because geneticists are coming right now, folks, to the idea that the genome does not, that they're missing something, that there's another mechanism that is managing genetic mutation and managing the actual growth of an organism. And they're calling this epigenetic. In other words, epi meaning beyond the merely genetic. And you're suggesting, if I'm understanding you correctly, that a social or cultural morphogenetic field, to use Sheldrake's term, is somehow playing an epigenetic role, and that these rituals or rites of passage, a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah, if you're Jewish, are somehow activating an epigenetic field to produce a certain kind of change in the organism. And I would absolutely, Katie, my intuition cries out that this is probably true, and much more importantly, that it needs to be studied. Sheldrake has done some of this, but yeah, in the chat room, I'm reading Eudemonus is saying, including religious rituals or Nazi party rallies and that vast ritualistic element. Yes. We have and I'm going to say this very bluntly, I don't care who it upsets. We have a culture now where most of our young people have grown up without those rites of passage, be they religious or be they, family custom or what have you. They've grown up without this, and they're completely and morally unmoored. So that it's okay for, some kid to get his dad's gun and go shoot up a bunch of people he doesn't like in school. We have so many absences of these rites of passage. I went through all the rites of passage. I was baptized as an infant. I went through confirmation, yada, yada, yada. And they mark certain periods of my life very distinctly in terms of what I was and who I was and what I was interested in and so on and so forth. And I've never made the connection until now when Katie mentioned it. So I think that's crucial, Katie, to something that you're getting at here. And doff my hat again. I think that's a brilliant observation. Now, turning to octopuses. Octopuses really are one of my favorite animals, and they have been since I was a kid. I don't know why. I used to argue with my friend Colin, my best friend down the street that I played with all the time. And we argued endlessly over whether or not octopuses would beat sharks in a contest, and I was delighted to find that video online when I posted the Oannes blog, because, there you go, Colin, you know, have your shark, the octopus is going to eat it for lunch and leftovers. This, if you haven't seen the video, go watch it. It's pretty cool. But, and I don't like sharks either. So for me, it was a double hit. But octopuses fascinate me for a different reason than you're suggesting, Katie, and that is, and I actually saw a video once online not too long ago that somebody speculated, we can thank goodness that octopuses do die when they're only about 3 or 3.5 years old, because they learn from each other very quickly. And they'll watch another octopus solve a problem and then do it themselves. And one guy I saw said it's a good thing that they don't live to be 70 or 80 years old, or humanity might have some competition from these things. They use tools, they decorate their homes, just all sorts of weird stuff about these creatures. So maybe, I'm speculating here, Katie, on the basis of what you're talking about environment, climate, and nutrition. Maybe octopuses may be shown to have a much longer genetically indicated natural lifespan, and for whatever reason it got shortened on Earth. There's geneticists that maintain that the human genome looks like it was designed for us to live about 120 or 130 years rather than the 70 to 90 that we're getting. So that may be too. I don't know, but they are fascinating creatures, and I think we've just begun to plumb the depths of how fascinating they really are. All right, now speaking of genetic studies, let us turn to. We're doing good. Let us turn to Jamie. I don't know if you're here in the chat room. You didn't put your username on the comments and questions, but here we go. This is regarding life extension studies and crony capitalism, and especially regarding life extension as a way to prolong the shelf life and thus the cost effectiveness of the machine polishing class, idem est, us in the future, since machine polishing looks to be the best fate intended for us. I think this view of the life extension situation dovetails in a most creepy manner with the replacement of human labor with machine productivity as a sort of half step toward a machine-run society, is to have a no longer lived human or even a later machine human servicing other machines. Meanwhile, given the rapid advances in AI and the fears already being expressed at that mid-level, decision-making type jobs will be replaced by AI as well. I come again to the vision of a system where robots or AI are legal entities and either pay taxes or simply surrender the fruits of their labor to higher ups, and the entire planet becomes a privately owned corporation, thus replacing most of human society, economically speaking. In which case, the interesting question is, why all the production either of goods or tax revenues by AI replacements for humanity? Off-world trade immediately comes to mind. So related to this, another question is this legal from the larger legal framework in the community of space-faring civilizations? One way among many, admittedly, of viewing such a situation is that robots may be being intended to be used to spoof a continuing biological civilization in order to continue to appear kosher or legal to their trading partners. Catherine Fitz's point about shunning bad actors being effective comes to mind, including that possibility of shunning and discovery might be a fear of malefactors off-planet as well. What if a lot of this upcoming AI spoofing of a biological economic system is an effort not to be shunned or shut down for crimes against a interplanetary system. In other words, that the production and revenues from an AI machine economy can be offered to off-planet judges as proof that the original biological civilization is continuing just fine while still turning a possibly huge illegal profit from permanent illegal subjugation of the earth. So far, I find it hard to believe that the entire planet, or pardon me, the entire rest of the galaxy are all of them that bad, even if I don't believe that they're necessarily good either. I mean, do unto others. Probably is an approach appreciated all over, even if all over or out there falls far short in practice. But then again, in our particular case, given our track record here on Earth, perhaps like has attracted like, which brings up another thought. Again, we were engineered, or pardon me, were we engineered or just plain old-fashioned manipulated for the purpose of making us so badly behaved and culturally suicidal in order to create an excuse to take us over without due process? Now, all very intriguing and worthy speculation, to which I'm going to add a few of my own. So in other words, consider this a revision and extension of your remarks, James. And again, I'm just tossing this out there for people to consider. What if the entire move to AI and to, for that matter, to grant it personhood, Europe is debating this right now, folks, as we speak. They are having serious discussions in the European Union on whether or not robots should be granted legal personhood status. Now, I am going to advance the hypothesis, the speculation, that all of this move to make robots persons, and they may be, I don't know, think to use the bad science fiction series of Star Trek once again. Remember, they had precisely this debate on Star Trek. Should Commander Data, an android, be granted legal personhood status? Well, I believe it or not, I took the position then, and I still do, given the episode, if you watch it, that yes, he should be. But I can see many cases where no, they shouldn't be. So I advanced this speculation for you. Could the move to legalize artificial intelligence as legal persons be part and parcel of the same movement to make corporations a person? And if so, what's the agenda? Well, I would argue that it could be advanced that what they're doing is eventually they're going to turn around and say that your everyday, average, ordinary, normal human being produced by the everyday, average human way of reproduction is no longer a real person. In other words, what they're really doing is they're pushing in a new guise a fascist sort of Nazi idea of super persons, so that ordinary persons become the new sub-person, become the new subhuman. And let me go a little bit further. I think it's going to get to the stage, and this is another reason I keep saying own the culture, because at some point, we're facing it now. I just read a story about a restaurant in Boston where the chef is a robot. Okay. Fine, but we're going to reach the stage where all we have to do is cultural creativity. And I think in a certain sense, that will be a good thing. But if you look at these technocratic twits that are running Western civilization right now, look at them carefully and try to imagine them either composing or really enjoying a symphony. Try to imagine them enjoying all 2 hours of Johann Sebastian Bach's B minor Mass or of Beethoven's Missa Solenis or what have you. And you'll discover what I'm getting at. These people do not have any real cultural human depth. And the society that they're creating is inhuman. And that's why they have all of these debates about the personhood of AI or personhood of corporations and so on and so forth. And that is coming out of a theologically twisted tradition that is associated with a particular bishopric in Christianity that assumes that it speaks for the whole church and does so infallibly. That sounds an awful lot to me like satanic pride. All right. Next on the list, we have Xenophon. And Down Under is in the chat room and says, what an ungodly hour to get out of bed. Well, we were talking about ungodly things, Down Under, so you're here just in time. Anyway, this one is from Xenophon. And we're getting up, these have all just been fantastic questions, guys. So, and we're getting to a few really interesting questions coming up. Xenophon says, question 1. I listened to the most recent of the Giza dialogues, which started with the question of the age of civilization and which had to begin with the age of man. Folks cannot get past 6,000, 10,000, 12,500 years ago. The conversation mentioned Cremo and Thompson, who present evidence of people like us millions of years ago. The conversation considered Eve and the mystery of the Y chromosome, which appears to be older than Adam. Actually, no, it's older than Eve. The assumption that I want to confront is the idea that Anunnaki created modern man. Who said that they were created from scratch? I never did. If you listen carefully, Xenophon, to what I have said, is the texts tell you that they took some existing hominid or humanoid on Earth and created a chimerical creature out of that. I never said it was from scratch. Ever have I said that. If they had the ability to manipulate genetic material, then they certainly would have had a means of preserving such material. It can be assumed then that they would have had a database of preserved genetic material to choose from when creating man. The genetic material could have been modified to suit their specific needs. And that, I think, is a possibility. I do think that's a possibility. The preserved material available to them could have been a la Cremo and Thompson, millions of years old, and given the scientific scope of the task, could have been modified or selected from samples of people from any era. Also true. If a sample were modified to suit current needs, we should not be surprised to find people like us, hundreds of thousands or even millions of years old, and given the ability of ancients to manipulate genetic material, we find our own genetic material traceable only to mitochondrial Eve. Well, again, that's not true, because we have been able to trace Y chromosomal Adam to a period older by, I think, about 100,000 years older than mitochondrial Eve, which again is very, very weird. Weird in the sense that it dovetails those ancient texts of the male donor to this project being, the gods. It even fits the biblical text where you have Adam created at some point, and then at some later point, Eve is created. So these textual correlations with this genetic idea constantly astound me. This does not eliminate the validity of Cremo's and Thompson's discoveries of people like us being older. The genetic manipulators among the Sumerians could have been just experimenting with genetic materials that were older than we presume, and that they invented. And it is clear, even from their point of view, they guessed wrongly about their choices. Well, again, Xenophon, you misheard everything I said. I never said that they created mankind from scratch, ever. I've never had that view. All I was trying to do by mentioning Cremo and Thompson is point out precisely the fact that you have a certain body of evidence out there that, if you're willing to consider, means that some sort of intelligent life, probably humanoid in its fashion, uh, existed on this planet long before the evolutionary uh, dates would suggest, and long before, for that matter, that the Western Christian tradition would suggest, that you have all of this evidence. Um, and again, that tradition, is coming largely from Archbishop Usher. God bless him, trying to figure out the age of the Earth on the basis of biblical dates. Um, anyway, the next one says, skip this question if you are under duress. I'm not under duress. He says, it was strange to me that you stated in the most recent U.S. Pacific time zone Vidchat that you have never discussed carbon-60, except that you had blogged about it. Well, come on, be fair, Xenophon. I've written over 30 books. I've been blogging for 10 years and doing vidchats. I can't remember everything I've said. I think in the context, Xenophon, what I was getting at was that was never a question that had appeared in a vidchat question, if my memory serves me correctly. But anyway, neither 6 of one, half dozen of the other. So I submitted a question which you held to the very last position in the Europe-Africa vidchat. You gave a very informed answer to my comments about carbon-60. You even said that you were willing to try ingesting carbon-60. One vidchatter said that he or she had been taking it for 4 years, and during that session, I referred to a vidchatter to a European source for carbon-60. If carbon-60 products improve someone or some animal's health, which ostensibly it can do, but at some future cost, mind control, genetic manipulation, or etc., then I feel bad about making the referral, especially while I have reservations myself about the sale of the substance without government controls for what they are worth, which I would say with the GMO thing, probably not worth all that much, or legal recourse, worth something only if there are formal controls. So your statement mystifies me, and I can think of 3 possibilities. One is you simply forgot that you had discussed carbon-60, which is entirely possible. Another is that the Mandela effect is active in this instance. No, because this is not Mandela effect. Mandela effect, let me once again try and be very clear. It's not about what cereal was spelled this way or that way, or what cartoon series was spelled this way or that way. It's about people, famous people, dying, who later you find out haven't died. And in those cases where you think that someone has died, in most of those cases, you remember hearing a news story about it. This is to me the Mandela effect. There are not news stories about the misspelling of the Berenstain Bears or Cheerios or what have you. There are news stories about Nelson Mandela dying, or Helen Thomas dying, or Richard Chamberlain dying, that people remember hearing or seeing, and then later they find out that no, this person is alive and well. Kirk Douglas being another one. That to me is Mandela effect, because it's those news stories, Xenophon, that suggest to me that they are deliberately injecting either stories that they know to be false or stories that have actually happened to see if there is some sort of macro effect of the observer effect in the larger world. In other words, I think they're running a kind of sociological physics experiment, if I can put it that way. So no, I don't think it was Mandela effect. So we can dismiss that one. It is also possible you were told to say that you have never discussed carbon-60. No, I was never told that. So if you are being pressured not to discuss it, there are a lot of people that heard you talk about it who must be wondering if they're taking it presents some danger. No, I was not warned off. It was simply, I think in part it was simply memory lapse on my part and misunderstanding of what I was trying to say on your part. as I recall, I was simply saying that we hadn't really ever discussed it in Vidchat. Do I know of an actual hazard in ingesting this molecule? Is it a hazard of external control, present or future? I don't know of any hazard, and I don't know of any links to a mind control or mind manipulation technology in it. All right, question number 3. There is a buckyball gold molecule, AU32, which is not all that easy to synthesize, but which is claimed by its New Zealand discoverers to be the counterpart of carbon-60. My first thought was that it is possible that the technology of the ancients' fascination or craving for gold could have developed a molecule that exceeded in usefulness monatomic gold, which is assumed to be the substance that Moses made from the golden calf, and which was assumed to have been found in large quantities by Sir Flinders Petrie in an Egyptian temple on Mount Horeb. I tend to think that Moses offered the powder of gold in its monatomic form to his followers, but it is possible that several other forms of nano gold could have been manufactured at this site at an earlier time when longevity was greater. I don't know anything about this gold 32 that you're talking about, so I don't know, Xenophon, if it would be possible with the technologies that they had back then to synthesize it. I would be guessing so in the dark that even any end of the twig speculation I might blog about on this or talk about would be simply shooting in the dark. If what Petrie found was monatomic gold, then it may be worthwhile to search through samples using available instruments for other forms of gold, which may be in the strata of the site. What if gold was part of the answer to longevity? That indeed is the argument that Lawrence Gardner makes in that book where he's discussing that site. If so, a declining culture would have received some benefit from cakes of monatomic gold, but how long did they live compared to the folks of the higher civilization that preceded them? Could the depiction of cakes being presented be historical, or were they solidly contemporary with the manufacture of the presumed gold powder found by Petrie? Let me stop and take that question, because if you look at the text, be they biblical or Sumerian or Egyptian, most of those texts do indicate that humanity lived a much longer time long ago in history than it does now. The biblical text, actually, if you graph out the biblical text, you start off with Methuselah, and then you've got that whole patriarchal age. It graphs an S-curve from a lifespan around 900 years down all the way to our current 70 or so years. So it's an S-curve. And there's been all sorts of ridiculous evangelical speculation as to why that is. The S-curve is there, but why it is, I don't know. If you look at the Sumerian or Egyptian kings lists, you have people living not just near 1,000 years, and not even just tens of thousands of years, but hundreds of thousands of years. So there is, if you look at it from that standpoint of view, and take the text at their word, that they're speaking literal truth and not giving you mathematical codes, which is also possible, then you've got a decline of the lifespan by several orders of magnitude. And again, there may be several reasons for that. I can advance speculations, but that's all they would be. All right, continuing. Carbon-60 has literally fantastic properties for human health and for preventing health issues from radiation. Its present and future value may be evident in the marketing of bottles of water soluble C60 throughout Russia, and also sold in Slovenia under the brand name Svetla. This product is commonly used by athletes in Eastern countries to enhance performance. It has many other benefits in its pure form, but it can be mixed in with any other nanoparticles, such as microprocessors. The molecule has already been used in the transport of portions of DNA that are necessary to produce chimeras. Buy an unregulated product and you relinquish legal recourse. If monatomic gold bonds to DNA and has superconductive properties, what will buckyball gold do if it can emulate or exceed the benefits of C60? The elephant in the room is the lack of published research. These discoveries are shattering, so where are the studies? Again, good question, Xenophon. I don't know. In fact, I don't know anything about this buckyball gold or carbon 60 and its alleged health benefits. I'd have to see those things before I took any of that stuff for my own, and I would have to make absolutely certain of the supplier. That, discretion's the better part of valor here, folks. All right, now this one is from Kurt. And after Kurt, we have Dr. Walter Bishop. Then we have Blake Cosmos. And then we have Baz, who's been waiting patiently. Sorry, Baz. All right, here we go. Kurt says, hello, Dr. Farrell and fellow geezers. Here's a question for your consideration in tonight's Vidchat. I recently came across a quotation from Carl Jung having to do with the presence of the chakras in the Western tradition. Here's the quotation from Jung, quote, these centers are the so-called chakras, and you not only find them in the teachings of yoga, but can discover the same idea in old German alchemical books, which surely do not derive from a knowledge of yoga. Jung is suggesting that the West has its own source of this knowledge. Jung's quotation reminded me of something I had noticed in William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell about a month ago. Now, this is interesting, folks. We're going to get William Blake. In the poem, Blake presents an almost perfect depiction of the chakras. What's more, in his imagery, it has a Western alchemical feel to it. Here's the extract from Blake's poem, which Jung's quotation reminded me of. I was in a printing house in hell and saw the method in which knowledge is transmitted from generation to generation. In the first chamber was a dragon man, clearing away the rubbish from a cave's mouth. Within, a number of dragons were hollowing the cave. In the second chamber was a viper folding round the rock and cave, and others adorning it with gold, silver, and precious stones. In the third chamber was an eagle with feathers and wings of air, and he caused the inside of the cave to be infinite. Around were numbers of eagle-like men who built palaces in the immense cliffs. In the fourth chamber were lions of flaming fire raging round and melting the metals into living fluids. In the fifth chamber were unnamed forms which cast the metals into the expanse. They were received by men who occupied the sixth chamber and took the forms of books and were arranged in libraries. The giants who formed this world into its sensual existence and now seem to live in it in chains are in truth the causes of its life and the sources of all activity. But the chains are the cunning of weak and tame minds, which have power to resist energy. According to the proverb, the weak in courage is strong in cunning, unquote. Blake seems to be describing, and in the correct order, the root, sacral, solar plexus, heart, throat, third eye, and crown chakras, respectively. Yep. What's more, he does so with an imagery that is broadly consistent with the various chakras' functions. For example, the dragon man is the root clearing away debris. A coiling serpent is located at the sacral chakra. An eagle with outstretched wings is located in the capricious area of the solar plexus. A fiery lion is at the heart chakra, engaged in melting metals. At the vocal chakra, unnamed men give it form and shape. Idem est expression to the molten metals. And the third eye chakra is depicted as a vast library of knowledge. And finally, the crown chakra is described as the domain of the giants who are the source and cause of all life. The entire extract is fascinating, but it's Blake's fourth chakra, the heart, and its lions of flaming fire that caught my eye. Not the least of which because C.S. Lewis's iconic depiction of Christ as a big-hearted lion in the Narnia Chronicles. True enough. Also, because Blake's heart chakra looks an awful lot like an alchemical crucible. Ding, ding, ding. And this fiery crucible image calls to mind the Sacred Heart icon from the Roman Catholic tradition. Ding, ding, ding. So here's my question. Are we seeing in Blake's Marriage of Heaven and Hell the fusion of Christian esotericism, alchemical thought, and some other occult mysticism which includes the chakras? Has Blake drawn these disparate pieces together for the first time, or has he perhaps remembered and recollected fragments of a formerly unified tradition? What's more, might he have effected his poetic anamnesis without recourse to the Eastern yogic thought, and done so entirely by means of some source of hidden knowledge within the West? Any thoughts or insights or comments you would be willing to share on the above would be greatly appreciated. Kurt, doff my hat. I love that one. I love that one. And of all of those answers or possibilities, my suspicion is the last one, that he is accessing and revealing a hidden source. And the reason I say that is if you go to Spencer, the Fairy Queen, his famous poem, The Fairy Queen, you have another case of an English poet who is composing this poem that is absolutely chock full. There's just absolutely no way to get around this, just absolutely chock full of all sorts of esoteric imagery, symbolism, and so on. And this could not have come by chance or accident. It had to have come from someone who was thoroughly well informed about it. And the same holds true in William Blake's case. I'm going to go so far as to suggest that the same holds true absolutely in Percy Shelley's case. Not only in his poetry, but in Frankenstein. And yes, I totally agree with my friend Scott DeHart that he wrote that and made his wife, Mary Shelley Wollstonecraft, be the supposed authoress of this for various reasons. But I think that there is an underground esoteric tradition in England that comes from a variety of sources. You certainly see it in John Dee. You certainly see it in Francis Bacon. It suffuses England and its thinking at virtually every level that you can look at. So the question is, where is it coming from? And it would be easy to go the route and say, well, it's coming from that explosion of esoteric thought in the Renaissance. And in part, yes, it's coming from there. But the problem is, when you look at the esoteric thought of the Renaissance, what you're really looking at is the Hermetica and literally nothing more. There is a much deeper esoteric tradition. Raymond Lull, people like this, Giordano Bruno, and so on, that I think is coming out of an actual hidden tradition that is maintained by some sort of secret society in the West that has access to it before it ever gets blown out into the public during the Renaissance. And I mentioned this possibility way back in Giza Destar destroyed. And that is that when you look at the Middle Ages, this whole esoteric tradition kind of goes underground right around the 4th or 5th century. And then it continues underground until bang, it pops out at the Renaissance. So what's going on? How does this get preserved? My suspicion, Kurt, has always been and remains to this day that during a particular period of the history of the papacy, from let's say Sylvester the First to all the way up to people like John the Eighth, Nicholas the First, Leo the Third. That period of the history of the papacy, if you look at the popes themselves, you'll be astonished by two things. Number one, how many of them were Greek and not Latin. And number two, how very many of them had some sort of connection to the old Roman senatorial families. And therefore that were familiar, the Greek-speaking popes that were familiar with that whole Byzantine tradition, number one. And number two, like Constantine himself, Constantine Flavius, right, were Flavians, members of that very influential family. And I think a family that is very misunderstood by the people that want to rewrite all of that history as some sort of vast conspiracy. But on the other hand, they're right in singling out the Flavians in that they are preserving something by way of some knowledge. So in other words, there is a core group of people in the suburban diocese of Italy, in other words, the dioceses that are immediately surrounding the papacy, that have a connection to the old Roman imperial bureaucracy and Senate, not to mention to some of the imperial families. And that this is the group of people that you have to look to that are preserving some of this line of esoteric thought and tradition. I say that because when you turn to people like Leo III, Pope Leo III, this guy is, so to speak, the papal Donald Trump of the day, because he comes in as an outsider. He's not a member of a Roman senatorial family. The candidate standing against him was such a candidate, but nonetheless, Leo III is acclaimed. And then begins all of this problem, not only with Byzantium, but with Charlemagne. All right. So you see an outsider coming in. It's like, oh my word, the jig is up, the game is over. And Leo, like Trump, is very delicate. I mean, he's walking this diplomatic tightrope throughout his pontificate, and he's walking it very well, incidentally. So this is my suspicion, Kurt, where this is ultimately stemming from. Now, it's a guess, and I want to underline that. It's a guess based on what I know about the history of the period and the institutions that were involved in it. It could be another mechanism altogether that we simply haven't looked at carefully enough or thought to look at carefully enough. But I do find it very interesting that after the schism, in other words, after this connection with the Greek-speaking East is formally terminated, that you find the papacy involved in all sorts of very bizarre projects. The Albigensian Crusade was not only bizarre, but murderous, genocidal, and bloody. But you also have it involved in setting up orders like the Templars, like the Hospitallers, and so on and so forth. So it looks to me like it's trying to maintain control of something at the same time as it's trying to create mechanisms or instruments of discovery. And the whole period, when you examine it that way, is very, very suspicious. In other words, when you read medieval history with the eyes of an intelligence analyst, rather than the eyes of a theologian or a canon lawyer, or someone interested in the history of the philosophy of science, when you read medieval history with the eyes of an intelligence analyst, all sorts of stuff starts popping out of the text. And academia doesn't want to go there. I mean, they absolutely will not look at that period of history from that point of view, because it would just raise too many questions. So anyway, good questions, Kurt. Anyway, this one is from Dr. Walter Bishop, and he's on a rant about grammar. And I'm going to rant with him a little bit here. He says, "Dear Dr. Farrell, a strange question popped into my mind the other day when someone accused me of being a grammar Nazi. The funny thing is, for some strange reason, bad grammar really annoys me to the point of minor anger. And some of it really gets me too. Not to the point of anger, but just to the point of frustration. Like the American, since we're talking about hot buttons, Dr. Bishop, one of my hot buttons is quote and quotation. Quote is the verb, quotation is the noun. So you don't want a quote from your insurance agent, you want a quotation. Okay? And that's just one of my little usage hot buttons. Another of my usage hot buttons when I taught was the use of split infinitives. Now, I understand the modern grammarian's objection to the objection about split infinitives. I was simply trying to force my students to pay attention to the parts of speech. Star Trek made the split infinitive acceptable, to boldly go where no man has gone before. Well, it's to go boldly, according to the old grammarians, or boldly to go, or to go where no other man has gone before boldly. But the adverb does not split the infinitival form. Now, that was complete caprice on those old grammarians' part, because they were thinking in terms of Latin and Greek, where the infinitival form literally is one word and you can't split it. Okay, so they thought that would be applicable to English. And in fact, one of the unique things about English is that you can split infinitives and put your modifier squatting right in the middle of it. But anyway, to continue. To me, it is like someone running their fingernails down a chalkboard or playing duds on an instrument. To me, grammatical errors are like sour notes. When someone says, "I'm going to lay down," instead of "I'm going to lie down," it causes me almost visceral discomfort. And I stand guilty of that. I'm one of those that lay and lie gives a problem to, just like that and which, or shall and will. Okay? When people say "just between you and I," instead of "between you and me," it makes my toenails hurt. Or when they say "I use USE to like that," instead of "I used USED to like," it makes my skin crawl. And that one sends me too. And I can't tell you, Dr. Bishop, how many student papers when I was teaching, saw precisely that mistake. This is particularly strange, as I'm normally really not a neat person, nor am I particularly orderly or organized, except in my reasoning when arguing a point. Nor do I otherwise have a tendency to be a stickler, bean counter, or having many obsessive compulsive disorder tendencies. At the same time, while I am 99% accurate in grammar, both in English and in German, and that's a tall order, better than in spelling or punctuation by far, I do not know a single rule of grammar. I just know bad grammar when I hear or read it, though I have no idea how or why. It's like playing sour notes on an instrument. I know when I hit a wrong key on my piano or on my 1957 Hammond C3. In music, I at least once learned some music theory, even some counterpoint, during my studying of Bach's organ works and practicing the Well-Tempered Clavier, and even learning jazz shorthand. So I'm aware of the essential Harmonielehre, as well as the Fourier series of harmonics in physics. But in grammar, I have zero knowledge of any rules. So my question is there a common denominator between mathematics, music, and grammar, or even language as a whole? Which seems strange, as there are so many exceptions and irregular verbs in most languages, which don't seem to exist in mathematics, in music, or in physics, which allows one to intuitively feel the proper grammar, even in the absence of any knowledge of a formally explicit rule. If so, is this really intuition or is it something else? Is there an inborn sense, for want of a better word, for such things? Is there an inborn sense of right and wrong in general? Personally, I'm no fan of moral relativism, or pretty much any form of relativism. But does this apply to moral right and wrong as well? In other words, do we humans have the sense, or did we have it once, say before the fall, and then lose it? And if so, how can we restore this in a reliable manner? Now, I'm going to concentrate, Dr. Bishop, on the music and language angle of this, because I think you're raising a very important point about humanness and creativity. For example, there are people out there now who claim to have written computer programs that can compose music, so to speak, like Bach, like Johann Sebastian Bach. Now, notably, I haven't found anybody willing to try a computer program to compose like CPE Bach. That would be a very tall order, because it's CPE's calculated asymmetry that is the most grabbing thing about his music. In other words, he sets out deliberately to show you that there is a human being on the other end of that music that's going to do what he darn well wants to do, and he's going to have a good reason for doing it too, but you have to think about it. Now, the music that they claim this computer algorithm can write, I've listened to some of it, and I can tell you that if I were to hear it for the first time, and someone were to tell me that it was a new piece of J.S. Bach that had just been discovered, my reaction would be, well, you need to rethink that, because that doesn't sound like Bach to me. In other words, I can tell the product of a machine and the product of a human, and this is where language comes in, because you're pointing out all sorts of irregular verbs. English is chock full of them. As you know, in German, it gets just downright bizarre. And German, like English, can be a very orderly, tidy, this is the way things are language. I suspect that this need for an imperfection, let me use that word in quotations, for an imperfection, for a deliberate and willful departure from regular order, is a necessary human component to creativity. Now, obviously, modernism has made the departure de rigueur so that you have very little order left. And what happens? You end up with something inhuman, which leads us to the relationship of language and music. And if you haven't, Dr. Bishop, I would advise you again to go listen to those Bernstein lectures, particularly numbers 1, 2, and 4, because he points out that the relationship between language and music, and he's not doing this willy-nilly, he's not inventing this. What Bernstein is really doing, folks, in those lectures is he's giving you a tour of music theory from the standpoint, hear me now, from the standpoint of the doctrine of affect. That's what he's doing. And if you read the transcript, he will even use the word affect. He's giving you an important clue as to what he's really doing. That relationship between language and music, in other words, was well known in the 18th century. So that by the time he gets to lecture number 4, what is he doing? He's pointing out how you can take all of the rhetorical tropies and even all the parts of speech and draw musical analogs to them. And it's that analogous functionality that is driving the doctrine of affect. So is there a relationship? Absolutely. Now let me go a little further. If that's so, then when you go back to the ancient cosmologies where they are telling you that there's a musical structure to the cosmos, what they're also telling you is there's an analogical structure and there's a mental mind form that's undergirding it. In other words, they're not materialists. This is all the production of mind, of logos, of nous, whatever you want to call it, that is operative in this milieu, in this cosmology. So is there a relationship? I've always thought so, because you can, once you familiarize yourself with that doctrine, with that cosmology and how it thinks, you can sit down and listen to an instrumental piece of music from that era and see and hear the same linguistic, rhetorical tropies and forms in constant and very deliberate, calculated use. It's really, really amazing what these people were up to. And quite frankly, what they were up to was, again, they were putting a specific intention into the music. So the music is becoming a psychometric object that is, in their thinking, designed to use the modern terms, restore coherence, restore balance, give you that Aristotelian catharsis, the cleansing of the soul, and so on and so forth. This was not so much art to them as craft, and I mean craft in the fullest sense of that word, esoteric and otherwise. All right, now this one from Blake Cosmos, and then we are going to finally arrive at Baz. So Blake says, subject, questions as to operative functions, ethical checksums, boundaries for and agency within the topological metaphor of the medium. He says, Dr. Farrell, given that my skills and templates for interpreting reality tend to be bereft of anything other than a rudimentary grasp of mathematical theory, my dance with the metaphor has been thus more of a Gedanken experiment. Well, it's mine too. It's a thought experiment, as opposed to an effort to solve an operating set of calculations. Given this context and your patience, several new questions, and one very out there on the trembling twig of high-octane speculation, have arisen as a result. And so, of course, it follows that I have brought these particular questions here to the Vidchat like a picnic basket, full of metaphorical, metaphysical, moralistic coleslaw, like an awkward teenager without a date, to this cosmological cotillion of summers arriving. And so on to the questions. Number one, you have often referenced the presence of symbolic representations for objects and aspects of the topological metaphor, which, of course, because of the implications of alchemy, clearly infer the presence of transitive functions. It is this which leads me to ask, and I like that observation, Blake Cosmos, because yes, the topological metaphor is not an intransitive verb system. It's a transitive verb system. I like that. Why? Because at the very center of it is a mapping function. And of course, a mapping function in topology is analogous to a transitive verb in language. Okay, I love it. It is this which leads me to ask, can you shed some light as to if, apart from equivalence, what other kinds of functions exist within the metaphor? And further, do those functions run into a boundary condition within the metaphor itself? Answer. First of all, discard the idea of equivalence. If by equivalence you tend to mean identity, all right, and mathematically identity is written with an equal sign with an additional bar above it. So there's 3 bars. Interesting, 3. but anyway, equivalence and identity are not what the metaphor is saying. Because let's go back to what I've said all along. If you map or you recontextualize a thought, or if you're tracing an analogy, same thing, same function. If you're tracing an analogy from one context to another, what always happens? Well, you're losing the original context, and therefore you're losing a bit of the meaning that that form or structure had in that context. Yet, at the same time, you're picking up from the new context itself a new perspective. You're adding some meaning or some incremental portion of information to that structure by dint of its appearance in that context. So mere equivalence or mere identity is never in view. Now, that said, if you listen to Bernstein, he has a fascinating presentation of the rhetorical tropes of simile and metaphor. Okay? What is a simile and what's a metaphor? Well, a simile is, and he cites the Shakespeare line, Juliet is the sun. Okay? Now, why would Shakespeare have come up with that metaphor? Well, Bernstein reasons it's because subliminally present in Shakespeare's mind at the time are ideas of radiance, beauty, light, and so on and so forth. So it's those common elements between Juliet and the sun that creates subliminally the simile, or pardon me, the metaphor. Juliet is the sun. But what's the first stage that you have before that? Well, you have the simile. Juliet is like the sun with respect to radiance, light, beauty, blah, blah, blah. So metaphor in Bernstein, and I think this is very clever, is created by the final deletion of that verb is, or pardon me, is the final deletion of the modifier like, pardon me, so that you get the metaphor now, the equivalence, Juliet is the sun, which is, to me, looking at the way that my notes on the metaphor operate, is almost perfect a description of what's going on. And composers do this all the time. It's deletion of all the unnecessary schoolboy, prosy, descriptive, argument, so that you just make the poetic statement that has this enormous substructure of argument that we are probably not even aware of that's behind it. So I urge you, if you haven't watched those lectures, go back and watch them, because what he's giving you is a tour de force of the doctrine of affect. All right, absolutely. He was too much of a musicologist not to have known about these things, and he uses it to great effect in his music for Broadway musicals. West Side Story, Candide. His music for those musicals is chock full of all of these formal procedures that really are very, very 18th century, when you get right down to it. And the interesting thing to me is he's consciously aware of them. Unlike a lot of composers, he's consciously aware of them and how to do them. So anyway, I would agree with your transitive idea. The only exception I would take is this equivalence idea, because equivalence misses the fundamental step of that transitive function of moving, that analogical function of moving from one context to another. All right, number 2. Did I correctly understand you and that you told us the metaphor has its own morality? Yes, you did. Or conversely, is the metaphor morally neutral and capable of producing equivalent results for good or evil, depending on the understanding and intentions of the operator? Now, Also a good question. I think that if many people were to look at those passages in my books where I'm, giving you the rudiments of the metaphor and its topological expressions, that many of those people would be tempted to conclude that this is a morally neutral technique. But when I say topological metaphor of the medium, I'm meaning to say that it is a metaphor of actual philosophical processes and thoughts that you can find in several cultures all over the world. And when you examine those cultures and how they are expressing this metaphor, I have yet to run into an instance, be it Hindu or Chinese or Christian or Australian Aboriginal or what have you, where there is not some sort of moral slant to it. This is particularly the case in Plato, where he's saying, no, this is the good, and this is not evil. It's particularly prevalent in the Platonic and Neoplatonic expression of it. So yes, I think that you have to beware of mistaking the mathematics, so to speak, for the thing itself, and it's the thing itself that I'm really interested in, and I'm simply trying to use mathematics to show the technique and what's going on so that anybody can approach it and say, oh yeah, I'm familiar with that because I'm a physicist and we use this technique to model experiment, what have you. It goes on everywhere once you're really familiar with what that mathematics is expressing. So number 3, independent of the answers to the first 2 questions, here's my third and more metaphysical question. Is there an agency aspect within the metaphor to, if you will, police the ways in which the medium itself is being manipulated? Or does that function lie in the structure of the metaphor being subject to the boundary condition I proposed, one that was placed there to put a limit on the spread and effects of evil? And finally, the corollary to that, regardless of where this policing action occurs, how, when, and by whom is this agency accomplished? Oh, that's a wonderful, wonderful question. Doff my hat. Yes, there is agency in it. And the policing action, and this is, let me go back to what Dr. DeHart and I put in Yahweh, the two-faced God. You can understand the metaphor in an atheistic way and in a theistic way. And if you really get it, you can do so at the same time. That's why it appeals to me. There's a famous Eastern Orthodox saint that said, by the name of Gregory Palamas, that said, if God exists, the world does not, and if the world exists, God does not. And to a Western mind, this makes no sense. It'd make more sense to a Buddhist or a Taoist than it would to a Western Christian. But even if you take the metaphor in a philosophically atheistic sense, and I mean philosophical atheism as to distinguish it from communist atheism, which is kind of half-baked philosophical atheism, but rather I mean it that if your considered view as a rational human being, and that is your honest conclusion, and if you're looking at the metaphor from that point of view, it's still going to be a metaphor with goodness embedded in it. All right, that's what I mean by that embedding. So on to policing or agency. If you look at the metaphor tells you, and I wish that now I had put more of my mathematical thinking from my private notes into those books. But one of the things that I was concerned about when I first started this way back in the middle 1980s, and then I started to elaborate on this when I was teaching and watching students think. And constantly, I was running up against the idea, and this goes to Dr. Bishop's previous question about the relationship of mind and music. So now we're going to talk about the relationship of linguistics and metaphor. Because all of us have become accustomed or been confronted with people who will draw an analogy to something that just doesn't fit. It's like these numerological people that say, oh, well, this numerical correspondence here means that. And then they base all of this, cartload of speculation on a minimal investment of fact. And I'm paraphrasing Mark Twain there and his thoughts on the theory of evolution. Who said that, it gets wholesale dividends of speculation on a minimal investment of fact. But anyway, people will always argue, well, it's analogous to this, it's analogous to that. And then some people say, well, that's not a proper analogy because of such and such and such. And I got to thinking, well, then what makes an analogy to us seem either apt or inept? In other words, is there a way to formally specify an apt or an inept analogy? And I came to the conclusion that yes, there was, because an inept analogy will stand on very, very few scalars. Please hear me now. Whereas an apt analogy will stand on a much broader basis of scalars. And what's a scalar? A scalar is simply a thing without any dimension or reference, all right? It's a magnitude. So in other words, when Bernstein is talking about Juliet and the sun, Juliet is the sun. When he's talking about that metaphor, underneath it, he says there's a simile. Juliet is like the sun with respect to a whole set of elements, okay, that appear to be true of Juliet and appear to be true of the sun, okay? The more elements that you have present when you're drawing an analogy that are present to you consciously, the stronger that analogy is, believe it or not, even at a subliminal level to the person that hears it. That's your policing agency. And then there's another one. And again, I'm drawing from my private speculations here. There's another one. If you are able to envision a circumstance where an inept analogy is imposed, think again back to those grimoires with their demands that you do, that you boil the heart of a cat for 40 days and then put it in a cloth made out of a pig's ear when the sun is shining, when the moon is in the new moon phase at dead noon to accomplish such and such a thing. Well, you're describing a process where you've got a bunch of inept analogies that have no tangible relationship to the result that you're trying to achieve. Not even at that level where you start looking for, well, what are the correspondences here to this result? And you discover there are none. When you're dealing with that kind of situation where you are attempting to impose an inept structure on a population or upon an individual, that's where you're getting into those areas of evil and black magic, which is, again, and I hope I'm making some sort of sense to you, which is inbuilt to the metaphor. So in other words, the more natural approach is to look for as many correspondences as you can, and then to trace those correspondences through to a new context in a positive way. When you twist those correspondences where there is no, so to speak, musical connection between what you're doing in the music and the text that you might be singing, that ineptness also translates, and it comes out at the other end as an uglification, as an irrationality. I hope I'm making sense. And Bernstein talks about that too, the mismatched components. And he talks about those mismatched components precisely when he starts talking about modern music, Schoenberg, Stravinsky being the examples that he chooses. So yeah, I think there's a policing mechanism. And I hope that made some sort of sense. All right, number 4. I will close by climbing way out onto the end of our off-visited twig to ask you to entertain something entirely speculative and perhaps unrelated. So here goes nothing. Given that every treaty includes specific conditions as to maintaining clearly established boundaries, does your concept of a cosmic Versailles template possibly actually constitute the boundary layer around that specific portion of the topological manifold that corresponds to human activity? Or stated in simpler terms, as opposed to the concept of a digital matrix, is our reality more accurately described as a human culture within a petri dish, isolated within a biologically secured cosmic area for experimentation? I will pick myself off the ground now, dust myself off, and patiently wait your answer. In other words, is the Earth not only a prison planet, but an experiment? And I would have to say yes. And your bigger question is there some sort of fence around human thought itself to prevent us from running amok with that metaphor? And again, my answer would have to be yes. Because why? Well, remember, in some of those traditions, that ancient masculine hermaphroditic chimerical androgyne, or whatever the heck it was split. And this comes out particularly in the Popol Vuh, the Mayan creation account, where you have an androgyne. And then the gods say, oh, we can't have that. This dang thing is it's too smart. So we got to go down there and break up the sexes. You get a little hint of that in the Genesis version of the Tower of Babel. Well, we got to stop that activity. You know, they're speaking one language. You can't have that. Got to go down there and scramble the languages. Otherwise, you know, these little monkeys are going to be doing things we don't want them to do. You've got the observation of Maximus the Confessor, you know, that the fall is a fall into the dialectic of opposition. It's a fall into a way of thinking. So yeah, I think that regardless of what tradition you're looking at, Jewish, Christian, Mesoamerican Aboriginals, you're looking at kind of the same story. Very interesting question. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we have, yes, the androgyne embodies the split infinitive. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because, you know, what kind of humans are we? Well, you've got that weird bit of stuff that Dr. DeHart found of the Department of Energy investigating alcoholism, ear wiggling, tongue curling, perfect pitch, and homosexuality. And we discovered that these Dutch neuropsychologists had dissected the brains of Dutch male homosexuals and found out that their brains are a bit male and a bit female. So are we looking at another one of those little manifestations of that primordial androgyne that somehow didn't get adequately split apart in everybody? Who knows? I don't know. All right, Baz. I'm doffing my hat here to Baz before even reading the question, which I've already pre-read. This is a humdinger because it's in line with everything that we've just been talking about. And it's very short. Thankfully, short question, probably around Harvey's barn sort of answer. He says, hello, Dr. Farrell. Hope you and the geezers are thriving. And then he cuts right to the chase. Yeah, this is a book hint time, folks. He cuts right to the chase. No preliminaries, no warnings, no comments, just the question. How did the Baroque masters incorporate the concept of time into their works? And what is your conception of how they transacted time as it relates to a localized affect? Did the purveyors of music, spelled with a K, in the 18th century understand time differently than we do today? Last part of the question first. Every indication that I've had about those composers and studying this doctrine of affect indicates to me that yes, they had a very subtle understanding of time, and that it was in part due to the fact that they could conceive of time as passing simultaneously, faster and slower, within several different lines of music. So in other words, their vision of time was multidimensional in a way that a modern physicist's vision of time and ability to mathematize it is not. In modern physics, time is simply a delta t function, okay? It's describing a one-dimensional process, a system state change. With those composers, you're dealing with people that knew every trick in the book, backward and forward, augmentation and diminution being plays on time particularly, that again, you can hear Bernstein will play this for you in the first and second lectures in that Harvard Norton series, so that you can hear what augmentation and diminution mean musically. Augmentation simply means stretching out the time value of the notes. Diminution means speeding up the time value of the notes. So this is going on all the time, and it's going on in several layers of music, all happening simultaneously. He uses the first movement of Mozart's 40th Symphony to illustrate those things, but you can find them in almost any composer of that era, moving in several lines of music at the same time, if your ear is trained to be able to pull out those patterns. All right, this is pattern music, patterns and permutations, that's all it is. But now, how did they incorporate this otherwise? Did they have a sense of time to create certain affect in their pieces? And again, when I study certain scores of J.S. Bach, and even C.P.E. Bach, you find Zelenka, since you like Zelenka, another one. Zelenka and Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach were some of the first composers to compose music without meter signatures. And in doing so, they were looking back to the Middle Ages, because if you look at medieval chant, all you find is a bunch of notes. It tells you nothing about how fast or slow it's to be sung. It tells you nothing about what we would now call a meter signature. In other words, there's no division of so many beats to a bar of music. It's still in that sense very rhetorically grounded. It's grounded on the movement of the text itself and the rhythms of the text that the priest or the choir or whoever is chanting. So they're looking back to a practice. But you find these astonishing works where there's no meter signature whatsoever in this, a piece of music, and you're supposed to figure out, well, I play this passage fast, I play that passage slow, and the only way that you can determine that is to sit down and examine, the music itself. So let's go further and look at meter signatures. 3/4 time, 4/4 time, alla breve, 6/8, 9/8, all of this stuff. Is there any indication that they are using the meter signature itself as an affect? And the answer, again, particularly in J.S. Bach, is absolutely yes. And I'm going to leave this to you, Baz, to figure out what he's doing and why. Again, this guy calculates every musical move he makes. So when you find a meter signature in certain types of music, chances are it's there for some affective reason. All right. So let me give you some examples. If you look at his settings of the Lutheran or the Catholic Mass, and let's remember, folks, the Lutheran Church in his day called the communion service the Mass. All right. So it's not an exclusively Roman Catholic term. Anglicans call it the Mass. If you look at certain settings of certain texts of the Mass, he will use meter signatures very definitely as an affective device. For example, in the B minor Mass, at the Incarnatus section of the Creed, that whole piece of music is written or composed in the meter of 3/2. In other words, 3 half notes per measure. And the question is why? And I'm going to leave it for you to figure out, why would Bach choose that meter signature for that specific portion of the Creed? It's very obvious once you think about it. And it's being done with other affective devices. The melody is falling. Okay, why? In a similar setting of the Gloria, I'm thinking of Bachwerke Verzeichnis 233, a little Lutheran Mass. That meter signature is in 6/8 time. And again, the selection of the meter signature is very deliberate. And again, the question is why? Well, again, stop and think of what 6/8 is, particularly if it's performed at a fast tempo, like this should be. I'd say not much longer, not a few seconds longer than 6 minutes to get through that whole piece. 6/8 time, performed that fast, is actually a duple time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right. So again, you have 2 divisions of a bar into units of 3. And again, why? And, we're scratching the surface here of affect. It's the choice of the instruments. It's the instrumentality that's accompanying a text if it's vocal music. It goes on and on, folks. I can assure you that, the medieval theorist Matheson made an interesting statement that musical composition in that era was an effort of, and these are his words, not mine, was an effort of cold calculation. There are reasons for everything. Yeah, Eudemonist got it. Part of it's Trinity, but what's the 2? What's the 2? Right, you're getting it. You're getting it. Some of it's very obvious. Some of it's not obvious at all. You have to really ponder, and it becomes much more second person. That's one reason. There's another one. There's another one. There's another one. Instrumental music becomes even more difficult because they're still applying the same doctrine, but now they don't have texts guiding the application of affects. So again, what are they doing and why? My organ teacher, the first lesson I ever had with my organ teacher, he put up a piece of music for me to play, and I start playing, and he said, stop. I got like maybe a bar and a half into the music. He said, stop. I said, what's the matter? Am I not doing it right? He says, it's not that. He said, you didn't look at the score. You didn't find out what's going on in this piece, and therefore, how am I supposed to play it? Oh, okay. And so we started going through the score, and he starts pointing out all of these little things that even in college, when I took organ lessons in college, my professor did not point out to me. Yeah, one of the things that he had told me, Baz, was to point out the difference between a masculine fugue subject and a feminine fugue subject and how to recognize the difference, and the special cases of androgynous fugue subjects where the subject is both masculine and feminine, you know. And it's true, there are. It's very true. It's very, very true. So affect is all over the place, Baz. And those are the obvious ones. There are less obvious ones. Why are certain things in certain keys? Because remember, in the tempering systems that Bach had, he did not play music on equally tempered instruments. It's the well-tempered clavier. So in a well-tempered system, certain keys of music are going to have much different effect on the hearer than they are on an equally tempered system where all keys sound kind of more or less the same. The difference between flat keys and sharp keys and so on, that's all part of the calculation. Why are certain things written in sharp keys? Why are certain things written in flat keys? And so on. All of it. All of it. Pure calculation. Pure calculation. And would to God we'd get back to some sort of aesthetic where we are crafting our art or our literature or our music with that attention to detail. It has not been done since, with maybe the exception of some of Bernstein's Broadway musical pieces. It's 3-2, not 2-3. There's no third notes. The second person, two natures. You also find him writing in the B minor mass in 6/4 time. Now, what does that mean? Why is that there? And again, his possible reasoning there was not. It was partially Christian, but it was partially esoteric. On and on we could go. Someday, if I can figure out how to do it, folks, I want to do a webinar on just one short little piece of music, that piece I've referenced earlier, for Cycnus number 233. It's about 6 minutes long, and just all of the affect that's going on in that piece. There are 3 different fugues in it. Three different fugues, all set over kind of a huge orchestral ostinato, where the trumpets and the violins and the oboes are doing their own little interesting affective things. It's an enormous amount of calculation that went into just a short little piece of dance music, quite literally, for the church in 6 minutes. 6 short minutes. And you take that and then you start looking at instrumental music. You know, Zelenka, you like Zelenka. Well, listen to some of his little orchestral suites sometime, and with a view to affect, or listen to some of C.P.E. Bach's harpsichord concerti, and you know, why is he doing this? News on the organ. Folks, I have a special thing I want to ask you. Please direct inquiries about the organ to Catherine. There has been another delay. I'm getting very upset at this. And at this point, I feel like I've been made the de facto spokesman for this project. I'm the recipient, not the spokesman. So I'm asking everybody to refer their inquiries to her. Down Under says, I've always wondered if people who are dumb and cannot hear, if they feel music when it is played. That's an interesting question, because if they're deaf, I don't know if you know the story Down Under of Helen Keller very well, but after she had learned to communicate with sign and with actual physical touch, she could listen to Beethoven, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and tell it was the Fifth Symphony simply by all the rhythms that were going on. And she got to the point where she could you could put a piece of music on the record player, and she would have the record player on a table, and she would put her hands on the table and feel the rhythms of the music and be able to distinguish pieces of music simply on the basis of the rhythm alone, which, that's that's a fantastic ability to develop, to the height and degree that she did. So I think, yeah, it's possible that something like that. And I think even deaf people have some innate notion of different tones in their mind. And the reason I think that that's possible is that back when I was composing regularly, I would hear tunes in my mind, not anything audible, and be able to, sit down and write these things out on the score. So I think people kind of inherently have this, interior whistler, like we have the interior conversations. I think down under we have these interior whistlers that are, constantly whistling these little tunes in our head. Yeah, you can feel organ music. Oh yeah, definitely. That's part of the fun of playing the organ is, it's the one instrument you really feel it at a cellular level. Anyway, that's it. That was a good vid chat, folks. And we went 3.5 hours. So that's good. That's good. Hoo-wee. That's quite a tall drink of water. I'm checking my emails to see if I got any really late submissions, and I didn't, which is unusual. So, and Katu, remember your lengthy 5-page question thing. I'm going to archive, but remind me. And if I don't remember to get back to them, resubmit those questions. Kind of cut them down. The vibrations. It's the vibrations. And I think down under you could get to the point. I mean, thinking of Helen Keller again and what she went through, and the intellect that was chained up, in that body without any ability to see or to hear. I suspect that she was probably able to distinguish fast and slow vibrations. Do we feel time in non-musical situations? Sure, I think we do. I mean, stop and think about it, Baz. Time is such a fundamental component of our existence. It's almost unconscious. Anyway. We didn't have that many viewers on the YouTube feed, and we only got up to about 25. I hope people aren't running out of steam on the vid chats. And let me make sure I said hello to everybody. June, you snuck in. Ramura, you snuck in. P-Bud snuck in, joining us in Poland. So wonderful stuff. The new book is slow. This last week, every time I sit down under to try and do work on it, there's another interruption. I'm getting to the point where I'm going to have to curtail all speaking engagements and Solari quarterly updates so that I can get the time and get back into this book. Part of the problem with this book down under is I'm having to write it very differently than I'm used to writing. I have to write a little bit in one chapter and a little bit in another chapter. I can't sit down and just write it through, beginning to end like I normally do. And so that's kind of slowing things down because I'm not used to writing that way. I haven't written that way in a long time. I had to write that way when I did my doctoral thesis, but that was a nightmare I don't want to go through again. But this one is slow because of that, and it's also slow because as I'm writing, I'm still uncovering more and more research, so I'm also, reading at the same time that I'm writing. I've got about, on the good side, I've got about 2.5 chapters done. And I'm hoping to have the book done this year. And I'm thinking very, very seriously that this is going to be a Lulu book, because I've had it with publishers, getting the lion's share of my creative work. And this one is a very difficult book because I'm thinking of a particular subject, but I'm having to put it in a different context than it's usually talked about. And that's the difficulty. Thank you, Bez. Is Catherine back from Australia? I think she's in New Zealand right now. I think she concluded her tour of Australia. Right now, I think she's in New Zealand. And then she's going to be, as far as I know, she's going to be going back to Sydney and spending a couple days with some friends in Sydney. And then she's flying back here from Sydney. So she's taking the Pacific way back, not the European way back. So anyway, that's what's going on with her. She was touring with Richard Dolan. And she stopped very close to your old place of employment down under. Oh. Lulu books, I have, the tome is on Lulu. A few of my musical scores, which I have got to get back to and finish doing those. And they're just scores to particular movements. They're not the whole concerto. And there's only 3. Kurt asks, what possible sort of excuse do these organ people have at this point? Kurt, it has been a nightmare of excuses. And again, as I say, I would rather you direct any inquiries to Catherine, because at this point I'm hesitant to say anything. It's not my project, it's her project. And at this stage, the last update was the one that sent me. Let's put it that way. It just absolutely floored me. Absolutely floored me. My biggest regret is I feel responsible because I recommended these people over a couple of others, and I feel responsible. Anyway, yeah, deflect the anger, do some praying. If you're not the praying sort, think some positive things. It's been very frustrating. The other thing that's been, I meant to say this, I've been also involved with the process of trying to adopt a little dog from one of the local animal shelters here. I'm an animal lover, and saw this little pooch that got dumped, and I just thought, oh, come on, people, do better than that. Dogs are very loving creatures. She's a little Labrador golden retriever, maybe even a little bit of chow. I don't know. She may be adopted by the time I get her, so I've got alternative backups in my backups in mind. So I've been busy with that too. Plus, I had a crisis with my previous lawn service people that were just not mowing my God's half acre of wilderness where I live. So I have a new lawn service that so far has been very good. But I had that to sort out, and you know, K Tower says my sister-in-law delivers adoptive dogs all over the Midwest. Well, that's good. I'm glad people are adopting these animals. Otherwise they'd be euthanized. A goat, yeah, a goat. I need a goat, a little miniature goat to eat my lawn. Uh I do my lawn, except I don't have any place to put a lawnmower. That's the problem. I'd have to have a shed or something, and I simply can't afford that. Plus, it's a relatively big lawn to do, so I'd be, doing that. And in my copious spare time, I have so much extra time to mow lawns. Uh, I like pretty much any dog. Um, there are some breeds I wouldn't have, if I were to own one. Every time Joseph rants, the goat collapses. I know people that have little miniature goats, and my problem is I like pets in house. A goat would be kind of hard to house train, I would think. Plus, the goat would eat everything in the house, so I don't want that. A goat chewing on my library when I come home from the grocery store. uh, what I should get is an aquarium with an octopus, but I'd probably mess that up too. The octopus would escape, as they are known to do. Uh, Chime says I have to go and finish mowing the lawn. All right, Chime, we'll see you later. I'll stick around here for a few minutes and have some more cigarettes with everybody, maybe some spontaneous questions in the chat room, and then I will head out and make my dinner and do all that stuff. Kurt said I had a rabbit as a kid, brought it inside one night, it ate the couch. Yep. I've got lots of rabbits around, wild rabbits around here where I live. The woodpecker was back here yesterday, doing his construction zone project in my tree, in my tree out front. And I've got falcons. I've got a family of falcons that live somewhere around here that occasionally perch in my tree and screech. I've seen it all here: coyotes, foxes, falcons, vultures, even a tarantula once. That's a story I don't want to talk about. That was embarrassing. I'm just not a spider person, and seeing a spider as big as a small plate sitting about 1 foot from your right foot in the lawn, that is there a Gnostic webinar update? I decided, Baz, not to do it because I'd already done a Gnosticism thing in some of those webinars. And I figured I'd better get this book done before doing anything more on Gnosticism. And I'd forgotten that I'd put that up there in the webinar area. And it pretty much does everything I was planning to do anyway. So it was a case of forgotten webinar, really. Webinars take a very long time for me to do, so I don't know what my next one's going to be on. I have been thinking and toying with the idea of putting little snippets of the new book up on the site. He says, that's good. I was afraid I might disagree with it. Well, for me, Gnosticism is a technique rather than a set of beliefs. Schwarzenstein says the Gnostic webinar that's already posted doesn't really get into Gnosticism as a linguistic technique. That's true. It's more of a general overview of all of the techniques rather than just that one. To do just that one, I'd have to get into a lot of theological stuff that would probably bore most people. But anyway, K-Tower says we're all for snippets. I'm thinking about it. I don't normally reveal any part of the book, but if I were to do this one, it would probably give away the subject matter. That's my dilemma. So you may just have to sit tight and wait for me to get done with this dang thing. Once I get past the philosophical part, which would be the whole book, it should be fairly easy. There are plenty of linguistic clues in that Gnostic webinar. So if you go back and study it and then apply it to non-religious contexts, I think you'll see what's going on. It's all over the place. Will snippets affect the outcome of the book? Probably. That's the biggest negative weighing against it. And the other trouble is, this is the first book I've written, gosh, in a long time, where I've not written the preface first. I may not even have a preface in this book because of the nature of the material. K-Tower says, I don't know if you've ever considered this, but your readers, meaning K-Tower, nice one. Speaking for the entire readership, K-Tower said, your readers would welcome the chance to pre-study. Good one. That's a new twist. But yeah, I understand that, and especially on this book, because I'm throwing everyone into the philosophical deep end right off the bat. And people are gonna get mad at me. Oh, I thought this book was gonna be about this, and it's all about that. And there's methods in the madness. Yes, Eudemonist has had her ears perked for the little clues being dropped in the vid chats. I gave a big one tonight. Yeah, so if you don't like certain branches of philosophy, this is not the book for you. And since I can anticipate the question, well, what branch of philosophy does it have to do with? It has to do with metaphysics, epistemology, and something else. Eudemonist is quick to pick up clues because she's had to deal with people like me before. Tomas says, wouldn't happen to be theosophy related, would it? Nope. Not a chance. The problem of solipsism. In a way, yes. In a way, yes. Yep. That gets touched upon, Baz, in the very first chapter. Touched upon. In the ultimate expression of solipsism, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That was another hint. And yet another hint. And I'm quoting President Harry Truman. If that's art, I'm a Hottentot. But with those hints out there, the book is not about what you think it is. Will Descartes be in the mix? Yes, absolutely. Yep. Yep. Good guess. Good guess. Descartes makes a brief cameo appearance. So just, think of that Frenchman with his big schnoz and his pursed lips, his dissolute lifestyle, and our good friend Locke. I could probably smuggle in Locke if I wanted to, but the book is not about that. It's about something else. I could put Locke in there if I wanted to, but it would just complicate things. K Tower says Truman is like Hess. Was he really a good guy? Well, like all politicians of that era, he was a mediocre guy. The Mino, is that in there? Nope. Nope. That's another one I could put in there, but I won't. Kant, nope. I could put Kant in there, definitely. Definitely I could put Kant in there. But I'm not gonna, because again, the book is not about this. It's about something else. Definitely about something else. Plato's Republic will probably be in there. Yep. I can tell you that. And you guys are thinking, what is he doing? Oh, I wish I could tell you. It's a little bit of philosophy and it's a little bit of physics. Oh, it's a lot of physics. It's got some cosmology, a little of this, a little of that. It's kind of a smorgasbord of rambling, unconnected, disparate, discrete ramblings. Kozarev. Nope, Kozarev won't be in it. Karambit says, I think I see where you're going. Baz, the doctrine of affect and the success of the state. Yes and no. And I will leave it to you to figure out if the yes part is for affect and the no for the state, or the other way around, or altogether in both cases, or on and on we could go. Draw a Venn diagram, Baz. It will help you. So yeah, it will cover a wide range of topics in relation to the central topic. That's why it's so difficult to write this book, because I'm trying to avoid all the stuff that everyone has already done about it. Baz says in modern German there is a word Jein, meaning both yes and no. Yep. Kurt says, is the Republic central to it? Oh, yes, absolutely. This book will move us forward, asks K Tower. Well, I'm not sure what you mean by move us forward. So it's difficult for me to answer that. It is a book on my list of books over here that's taped to my monitor. But this book was supposed to be before the Hess book, but I ran into a certain something in the Hess book that said, no, I better do the Hess book first and then this book. So yes, it's related to Hess. And no, it's not about Nazis. Well, but as for moving us forward to the betterment of society and culture, oh, I hope so. I certainly hope so. But the problem there, K Tower, is you've always got to remember I'm just a hack from South Dakota. So, I'm not, that's not my goal. Let's put it that way. Now, if I were the Pope or somebody important, then yeah, I could think in those terms, but I'm not the Pope. Of course, if I were the Pope, watch for some changes. Oh, wow. That was a good vid chat, folks. Really provocative questions. Did I run into the Butte family? The name sounds vaguely familiar. I can't recall specifically, Tomas, in what context I may have run across it, though. Kurt says music, cosmology, and the art of statecraft. Yes and no. Baz says, so the book has always existed and yet does not exist, like Henry of Ghent's criticism of Aquinas. That was a criticism of Occam, if I remember correctly. Not Aquinas. Yeah, the book exists. I mean, I'm working on it. It's not completely done, so in its complete form, it exists only up here. Or no, I got that wrong, Baz. That was Gagnon and Occam. Gagnon's criticism of the ontological argument. Henry of Ghent, criticism of Aquinas. I'd have to go look that one up. It's not ringing a bell in my head. The Butte family lands in Scotland, Wales, renowned for his large occult library. Wasn't that library donated to a big foundation or something, that now that library has moved to either the Upper Midlands or Anglia? I want to say one of the two. I know there's a big public library in some manor out somewhere in the middle of nowhere in England that's supposedly the world's largest library of the occult. Wish I could remember where it was. I'm thinking Anglia for some reason. All right, one more sig, folks. Then I'm going to terminate it. I may be back in. I usually do check in, but usually so late everybody is either gone or in bed or asleep or something. But I probably will, after I finish this and have my dinner, I'll probably check back in later tonight and just see what if there's anybody still here chatting. Wow, I've just got a pile of emails. I know what I'll be doing tomorrow. Karambit says, in your opinion, what really was the message being sent with this last royal wedding? Well, I think Katie has it right, that they were sending messages to the whole Commonwealth. It was a Commonwealth uh, do. It's a the symbolism, because I didn't watch the royal wedding, so I'm taking everybody's word for the symbolisms involved. So yeah, it seemed to have been a message of, hey, we're going to resurrect the Commonwealth as a soft power political player. K Tower says, can I just say with no knowledge of Lulu that publishing early is great? But you see, K Tower, aha, Lulu will allow me to publish books privately that are not shown publicly. In fact, I have a couple of books like that on Lulu that nobody knows are there. So what I will do when the book is done, if I go the Lulu route, is I will send a couple of chapters just to see how they're going to do the formatting. And I'm going to ask them to do the formatting. And if it's decent enough, I will go with Lulu on this book. If not, I will go with Adventures Unlimited. Just say, hey, David, I've got another book done. You want to do it? He said, oh, yeah, sure. But probably this one on Lulu, because this is such an intensely philosophical work. It's unlike most of the other books, with maybe the exception of Philosopher's Stone and Thrice Great Hermetica. This is intensely philosophical. And it's intensely physics too. Gobs of physics in it. That's the part that's also giving me difficulty, because the lazy part of me just wants to plop up the equations and say, here, look at that. And I know that's not going to play. So I'm going to have to sit down and write out, okay, this is saying this and that's saying that and blah, 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 blah. So it's a difficult book for that reason, because I've got to refresh mathematics that I don't know or used to have, and try and understand the mathematics that I don't know, which is always a hit and miss guess sort of thing. I'm reading an 800-page book right now for the physics component of this, and it's just chock full of mathematics. Now, the Rittman Library I've heard of, but no, there's another library in Great Britain, and I'm thinking it's in England itself. And for some reason, I'm thinking it's in the Upper Midlands or Anglia somewhere. Kurt says he's going to have to read about Prometheus. Actually, the book is largely and exclusively about Frankenstein and the authorship of Frankenstein. Tackling Shelley's poetry, even English lit critics are hesitant to go there because it is so dense and rich. Have I decided on a 1-volume affair? I think probably it will be, Baz. At this stage, the way the writing is going, at this stage, I think probably 1 volume. Does he treat Prometheus? I don't recall that he does. It's been so many years since I've read the book. We did discuss a lot of his poetry when he was writing it. Queen Mab, Prometheus. What's the other one? We discussed a lot of his poetry. And he was originally going to do it, but we got, the more we were looking at the poetry, we just thought, this will be an immense book, and he decided eventually not to deal that much with it. And it is, if you read his poetry and all the imagery in it, it's just it's just dense. Anyway, folks, that's the last cigarette. So I'm stopping the feed and going to go eat, and probably going to pop in here much later tonight. I'm going to go eat, maybe watch a little film or something. Probably waste a little time on the other computer playing a game or something just to unwind, listen to some music, and then come back in here. Tomorrow I've got to go through all the emails and get ready for the blogs for next week and all of that good stuff. I've got an inbox that's just chock full of lots of good stuff. So thank you much